And welcome back to part 2 of our 3-part series on C-CDA to FHIR Mapping project. My name is Chun Li, VP of Clinical Informatics Department here at Availity. So today we're going to talk about the approach that the HL7 C-CDA to FHIR Mapping group have taken to map data from C-CDA to FHIR and vice versa, and some of the milestones that we have achieved so far. So there are two complementary approaches that the group has taken. One is abstract mapping, where the team is really taking a very close look at all the fields in CDA and FHIR. And for each of the fields in CDA, we generate analysis workbook on whether that field's map to FHIR and what's the target mapping, if so. And when the mapping is not available, then we'll say it's not supported. And sometimes, one field or one attribute in CDA can map to multiple FHIR fields. And that's where we'll kind of document the conditions of, when does it map to A versus a B versus C. So that's kind of what you see in the left-hand side of this screen. And the pros of this approach is it's really comprehensive. That's kind of your dictionary if you ever wonders, which field to map and what are your options. And we did the same thing for FHIR to CDA mapping as well. But we know how much implementers love and really appreciate the examples. So on the right-hand side, we're also getting our hands dirty with examples. Where we at the where we would create a non-PHI C-CD example and distribute that to a bunch of leading industry vendors who all have their own proprietary C-CDA to FHIR converting engine, and ask them to map that same inbound CCD to their FHIR resources and ask them to submit those FHIR resources. We have a central GitHub repository where we would host all this information. And we, talk. We sit together and talk and compare the differences and talk about why you map this way versus, they map that way, and what's really the best way for us to recommend to the industry as the guidance. So I'm going to talk more about that kind of harmonization or consensus process in the next slide. So here are the 6 vendors that participated in our mapping exercise: Availity, Oracle Cerner, Google Health, MDIX, Redox, and Smile Digital Health. We have weekly calls for, I think, 8 to 10 months. And we also have connectathon event where the vendors will kind of sit at a table along with some other, industry participant or standards guru to talk about the mapping as well. I'm using this one example in here, trying to get you a sense of, how that discussion happened from the could be very different mapping outcome from the different vendors to, the final recommendation that the group make. So this is an allergy code mapping where the source have action norm code of 1191, stands for aspirin. And, we're working to convert that piece to the FHIR resource. And here we're seeing, Availity is mapping that to, the Availity mapping looks reasonable in there. However, when we look at the source data, we'll notice that the source is actually included a translation in that code block where Availity is not capturing. If we look at the second vendor, Cerner here, they included both of the mappings in here. And for the third vendor, they didn't map anything in the coding array. For the fourth vendor, while they look like the second, the mapping of the second vendor, the system, if you take a close look, they have that, 2.16.A40, we call them a OID, the raw OID, rather than kind of more formatted link that says action norm in the end. So it's an action norm code system. And the last 2 vendors mapped very similarly to the second vendor. So in here, after the group's discussion, we agreed on a few things. One is, even though translation is an element that only exists in the C-CDA or CDA coding block and not in FHIR, we agree the data in translation is should be equivalent or very similar to the main code and should be brought forward in the coding array in FHIR. The second thing we agreed is that we look at Google, they are actually mapping that code, but just not to this coding array. They're mapping it to somewhere else. And we we say you can map it to these other places, but this is the coding for the allergy intolerance resource. So that is where you should put your allergen information. So you should make sure you are mapping in here as well. And for the fourth vendor, we discussed, then they agree that they should have constructed a common OID map in the backend. So when it hits some of the common OIDs, such as ArcStorm or SNOMED, it will automatically map that to the link to those code systems, just like the other vendors have done. And the other two vendors looks just okay, like the second vendor. And the other thing that the group discussed is the fact that only the first vendor, in this case Availity, mapped to the display of aspirin. So it helps if you have a human, you happen to have a human looking at this, you've got some context in there. The group agreed if the source have a display name, then that should be carried forward. In this case, the source actually did not have a display name, so the other vendors has to map it. And the reason for Availity to have that in its display is because it's doing its own upcycling processes, where it's relying on its ArcNorm map as part of its normalization processes to grab that standard display name of aspirin and move that forward. So once the consensus has achieved amongst vendors, then we go ahead and publish those snippet on the CCD or CCDA side and the relevant snippet on the FHIR side. And we publish in this website, CCDA online, that has the color-coded tracking capability developed by one of our group members, John DeMoore, where it's really, color-coded the same elements on the CCDA side and on the FHIR side. So the pink is the ID and root versus the yellow and green are different ID extension represented in this sample. So it made the mapping work on the implementer side even easier to understand, which part from CCDA is mapped to which part on the FHIR side. The next slide. And in this slide, I have summarized the milestones that we have achieved so far. So the HO7 CCDA to FHIR mapping projects really established in May 2021, so very young group. And in September 2022 is the first time that we introduced this CCDA to FHIR mapping topic to the HO7 FHIR Connectathon. And since then, we participated in every HO7 Connectathons. And between the connectathons, there's about like 8 to 10 months where we really hosted weekly vendor mappings every week to work on that mapping reconciliation process we just walked through earlier. It's really a very granular, very detail-oriented mapping comparison. So really thankful for all the participating vendors for their contribution in these efforts. And in May this year was a really exciting milestone for us, where we published, where we got ballot with our first set of guidance. So ballot is HO7 processes where a specification is formally solicited feedback from the industry. And here is our ballot result. So we've got 181 people registered to vote, and among those, 140 actually voted. And at the closure of the ballot, we reached the passing status of our specification. There's overall over 130 issues and comments being logged. And when we look at a breakdown of these comments and issues, we notice there are feedback all over the places, and terminology, data tab, and medication seems to be the places where people have the most comments about. We're now actively working to resolve these comments and suggestions. We've hosted 4 block votes so far, and we're getting very close in terms of getting to our second version of the publication that incorporated all the feedback that we can. So here is a snapshot of our implementation guide. It is actually an update to a prior guidance that's called C-CDA on FHIR. Before our version, the focus there has been on mapping the different C-CDA document types to the FHIR documents. So it's at a much higher level than our mapping, which is at a much granular level on the data elements and data attributes themselves. The first set of guidance really focused on patient allergies, immunizations, medications, problems, and procedure mapping. So this is our incremental approach. We really don't want the industry to wait too long. We've heard so many vendors are waiting for some sort of a guidance so they can double check their own mappings and making sure they're on the right track. So we don't want to take that big bang method, but we really prioritize these key clinical domains as a first batch. And now we're actively working through our next set of clinical domains that includes results, vital signs, encounters, and others. And the mapping guidance have included the guidance from both the C-CDA to FHIR mapping, which has been the focus, especially for the vendor sample harmonization side. But we have also included the guidance from mapping FHIR to C-CDA side. The guidance has also included both structural guidance and the terminology maps. So the structural guidance is showed in the screenshot. Basically, it says, field A on the C-CDA side should be mapped to field B on the FHIR side. And terminology maps are included there as some of the hyperlinks. Basically, for the specific attributes, terminology maps will tell you, if you get this value in this attribute, then you should map to this value to the relevant FHIR attributes. We've definitely also included the reconciled mapping samples from the industry vendors, as we talked earlier. So we included, kind of what we all recommend as the final best of practice, best of practice reconciled mapping as kind of, sorry, redo this last bullet. We've included also the reconciled mapping example from the industry vendors, like we walked through the examples before. So what's going to happen next is what we currently are working through, and at the kind of tail end of the block votes to get through the ballot reconciliation. We have already started expanding to other clinical domains, like these we listed here. And, if there's opportunities, we'd like to, maybe collaborate with others to see how things work in real world with the recommendations that we provided. So in our next session, we're going to talk about some of the challenges that FHIR either is not intended to address as a standard or, will not be able to address, basically. And talk about some of Availity's unique advantages in its own FHIR and Fusion offerings to address those challenges. So stay tuned.